The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 Aviation's greatest mystery. On March 8, 2014, in the early hours of a Saturday morning, a Boeing 777-200ER lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport and vanished into the night sky. Within hours, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 would become the subject of the most extensive, expensive, and baffling aviation search in human history. With 239 souls on board, the aircraft simply disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions that continue to haunt investigators, families, and aviation experts more than a decade later. This is not a story of terrorism or mechanical failure with clear evidence. This is the story of a modern commercial airliner that, in an age of satellite tracking and constant communication, managed to vanish almost completely from the face of the Earth. The disappearance of MH370 represents an unprecedented mystery in the history of commercial aviation. In an era where smartphones can be tracked to within meters of their location, where surveillance cameras capture nearly every moment of our lives, and where military and civilian radar systems scan the skies constantly, how does a massive aircraft simply vanish? The Boeing 777 that became MH370 was not an ancient relic. It was a modern marvel of engineering, equipped with multiple redundant systems, satellite communications, and sophisticated navigation technology. Yet despite all of this technology, despite the efforts of dozens of nations, and despite the expenditure of hundreds of millions of dollars, the bulk of the aircraft remains lost. The story of MH370 begins long before that fateful night in March 2014. It involves a sophisticated aircraft with an impeccable safety record, a veteran captain with thousands of hours of flight time, a promising young first officer completing his training, and 227 passengers from 14 different nations, each with their own stories, dreams, and destinations. Among them were artists returning from an exhibition, engineers traveling for work, families on vacation, and young children heading to Beijing. None of them could have known that they were about to become part of one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. What makes the MH370 disappearance so particularly haunting is not just the absence of the aircraft itself, but the absence of answers. In virtually every major aviation disaster in modern history, investigators have been able to piece together what happened, even when recovery of wreckage proved difficult. Air France Flight 447, which crashed into the Atlantic Ocean in 2009, took 2 years to locate, but it was eventually found, and investigators determined the cause of the accident. The wreckage of MH370, by contrast, has never been found. Only scattered pieces of debris, confirmed through serial numbers and forensic analysis, have washed up on distant shores thousands of miles from where the plane is believed to have gone down. The disappearance sparked Aviation, the largest and most expensive search operation in aviation history. At its peak, the search involved more than 24 countries, dozens of aircraft and ships, satellite analysis, underwater autonomous vehicles, and some of the most sophisticated technology available to humanity. The Australian-led underwater search alone covered more than 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, an area roughly the size of England, in waters up to 6,000 meters deep. The cost exceeded $150 million. Yet despite all of this effort, all of this technology, and all of this international cooperation, the main wreckage of MH370 remains hidden somewhere in the vast expanse of the southern Indian Ocean. This is a story that begins with a routine night flight and ends with an aviation mystery that has sparked countless theories, investigations, documentaries, and books. It is a story of human tragedy, scientific investigation, international cooperation, and conflict, media speculation, and the enduring question of how, in the most connected era in human history, something as large as a commercial airliner can simply disappear. This is the story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the aircraft and its final journey. The Boeing 777-200ER that would become known to the world as MH370 rolled off the production line in 2002 and was delivered to Malaysia Airlines that same year. Registered as 9M MRO, the aircraft was powered by two Rolls-Royce Trent 892 engines and configured to carry 282 passengers in total capacity, though it was carrying far fewer on its final flight. The Boeing 777 is widely regarded as one of the safest aircraft ever built. Since its introduction in 1994, the type had maintained an excellent safety record, with only a handful of hull losses in decades of service. The specific aircraft that became MH370 had accumulated 53,171 flight hours and completed 7,526 takeoff and landing cycles in its 12 years of service. The aircraft had not been involved in any major incidents during its operational life, though there had been one minor event in August 2012 when the wingtip was damaged during taxiing at Shanghai Pudong International Airport. This was a relatively trivial incident that was properly repaired. The aircraft's last major maintenance check had been carried out on February 23, 2014, less than 2 weeks before the disappearance. On March 7th, just 1 day before the final flight, routine maintenance was performed on the crew oxygen system, a standard procedure that subsequent investigations found nothing unusual about. The aircraft was in full compliance with all applicable airworthiness directives for both the airframe and engines. However, leaked documents that emerged 10 years after the disappearance revealed something that had not been publicly disclosed at the time. MH370 had been given supplemental fuel and additional crew oxygen supplies just before takeoff. This detail, while potentially routine, has fueled additional speculation about whether someone might have been planning for an extended flight beyond the aircraft's normal range, or whether the crew anticipated potential emergency scenarios. The significance of these supplemental supplies remains a matter of debate among investigators and aviation experts. The Boeing 707 that disappeared was equipped with multiple communication and tracking systems, all designed to ensure that air traffic controllers and the airline could monitor the aircraft's position and status at all times. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS, automatically transmitted data about the aircraft's performance and position. The transponder broadcast the aircraft's identification, altitude, and speed to air traffic control radar systems. A satellite communication system maintained contact with ground stations through an Inmarsat satellite high above the Indian Ocean. The aircraft also had 4 emergency locator transmitters designed to activate in the event of a crash, sending distress signals that could help rescuers locate the wreckage. Despite all of these redundant systems, designed specifically to prevent an aircraft from ever being lost, MH370 would somehow manage to circumvent or disable nearly all of them. The sophistication required to understand and disable these systems has led many investigators to focus on the possibility of deliberate human intervention, though the exact nature and purpose of such intervention remains hotly debated. The crew: Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid. In the cockpit of MH370 that night were 2 Malaysian pilots with vastly different levels of experience. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, age 53, was a veteran of Malaysia Airlines with an impeccable record. He had joined the airline as a cadet pilot in 1981, received his commercial pilot's license, and became a second officer with the airline in 1983. Over the following 3 decades, he had worked his way through the ranks, becoming captain of the Boeing 737-400 in 1991, captain of the Airbus A330-300 in 1996, and finally captain of the Boeing 787-200 in 1998. By the time of the MH370 flight, Captain Zahari had accumulated more than 18,000 flight hours, with 8,000 hours specifically in Boeing 707 aircraft. Captain Zahari was not just an experienced pilot, but also a training captain and type rating examiner, meaning he was responsible for training and evaluating other pilots. Colleagues described him as highly professional, passionate about aviation, and technically proficient. Outside of his professional life, Zahari was known to be a devoted family man, married with 3 children. He was also an aviation enthusiast with interests that extended beyond commercial flying. He had built an elaborate flight simulator in his home using Microsoft Flight Simulator X software, which he used to practice various flight scenarios and share tips with other aviation enthusiasts through YouTube videos. This hobby, simulator, would later become a focal point of the investigation. Zahari was also politically active and a supporter of Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim. Some reports suggested that Captain Zahari attended Ibrahim's court hearing on March 7th, just hours before the flight, where Ibrahim was sentenced to 5 years in prison on what many considered politically motivated charges. This timing led to speculation about Zahari's state of mind, though investigators who examined his background found no evidence of financial troubles, unusual behavior, or personal crises that would suggest he was contemplating any extreme action. Sitting beside Captain Zahari in the cockpit was 27-year-old First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, a pilot with considerably less experience. Farik had been with Malaysia Airlines for approximately 7 years and had accumulated 2,763 total flight hours. However, he was still in training on the Boeing 777, and the flight to Beijing would be one of his first flights in the aircraft outside of simulator training. He had only 39 hours of experience flying the 777, and Captain Zahari was supervising his performance as part of his transition training. Despite his relative inexperience on the 777, First Officer Farik was described by those who knew him as professional, dedicated, and eager to learn. He was engaged to be married to another pilot, Captain Nadira Ramli, whose father was also a Malaysia Airlines pilot. Farik lived with his parents 2 doors down from the mosque where he regularly prayed when in Malaysia. The imam of that mosque described him as a good and religious man. An earlier incident had surfaced in which Farik and another pilot allegedly allowed 2 young South African women into the cockpit during a 2011 flight, breaching security protocols, but this was never confirmed and did not appear to have impacted his career progression. The investigation into both pilots found no significant red flags in their backgrounds, financial records, or recent behavior. Malaysian authorities examined their psychological profiles, reviewed security footage from the days leading up to the flight, and found nothing that suggested either man was planning anything untoward. However, the deleted flight simulator data found on Captain Zahari's home computer would later raise questions that have never been fully resolved. The passengers, lives on board. On that Saturday morning, Flight 370 was carrying 227 passengers from 14 different nations. The majority, 153 individuals, including 1 infant, were citizens of the People's Republic of China. Most were returning home to Beijing after business trips or vacations in Southeast Asia. Among the Chinese passengers was a particularly notable group: 24 celebrated calligraphers and painters who had been in Kuala Lumpur for an art exhibition showcasing their work. These artists, some of whom were regarded as major figures in the Chinese art world, ranged in age from their 30s to their 70s. Their loss represented not just a human tragedy, but a cultural one for China. Also among the passengers were 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, a Texas-based company that produces microchips for various applications, including military systems. 12 of these employees were Malaysian nationals, and 8 were Chinese. They had been working to improve the efficiency of chip manufacturing facilities in Kuala Lumpur and Tianjin. Company officials described them as experienced professionals with significant technical backgrounds. The presence of these employees later spawned conspiracy theories about patent rights and industrial espionage, though no credible evidence has ever emerged to support such speculation. The passenger manifest included citizens from Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, India, France, the United States, Iran, Ukraine, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Russia, and Taiwan. Among them were families traveling together, couples on vacation or honeymoon, business travelers, and children. 3 United States citizens were on board: Philip Wood, age 51, who worked for IBM and was based in Beijing, and 2 young children, 4-year-old Nicole Meng and 2-year-old Yan Zhang. Philip Wood was an experienced traveler and a graduate of Oklahoma Christian University, where he had earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics and computer science. His girlfriend, Sarah Bajits, who was not on the flight, would later become a vocal advocate for the families of MH370 passengers, frequently appearing in media interviews and criticizing the handling of the investigation. 2 Canadian passengers were on board: Muktesh Mukherjee, an executive with Coal Energy and Resources, and his wife, Xiaomo Bai. The couple had 2 young sons and had lived in both Montreal and Chicago during Mukherjee's career in the mining and energy sectors. Paul Weeks, a 39-year-old New Zealander, was traveling to Mongolia to start a new job as a mining engineer. Before leaving, in a gesture that would later prove tragically poignant, he had given his wedding ring and watch to his wife, asking her to keep them safe and give them to his 2 young sons if anything should happen to him. Australian passengers included Catherine and Robert Lawton, a couple traveling with friends, and Rodney and Mary Burrows, who were looking forward to becoming first-time grandparents after their return home. 2 Iranian passengers, later identified as Puria Noor Mohammad Merdad, age 19, and Delavar Sayed Mohammad Riza, age 29, were traveling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, their presence raised fears of terrorism. However, investigations by Interpol and national security agencies quickly determined that both men were asylum seekers attempting to reach Europe and had no connections to terrorist organizations. Puria's mother was waiting for him in Frankfurt, Germany, and was aware he was traveling on a false passport. The tickets had been arranged through a Thai travel agent by an Iranian contact known only as Mr. Ali. The young men had stayed with a friend in Malaysia the night before the flight, watching movies and behaving normally before being driven to the airport. Each of these passengers had their own story, their own destination, their own dreams and plans. Families waiting in Beijing expected to greet loved ones that morning. Business meetings were scheduled. Children were coming home from vacations. None of them could have imagined that they were about to become part of one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. Takeoff and the final hours. At 00:42 Malaysian time on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, taking off from runway 32R. The night was warm with partly cloudy skies, typical for the region at that time of year. First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid was handling radio communications with air traffic control, suggesting that Captain Zahari was piloting the aircraft for takeoff, a standard division of duties. The takeoff was routine and uneventful. The Boeing 707 climbed smoothly into the darkness, beginning what should have been a 6-hour flight to Beijing Capital International Airport. At 1:01 a.m., 20 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft reached its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. First Officer Farik notified controllers of reaching cruise altitude, a routine communication. At the same time, independently of what the pilots were doing, the aircraft systems were functioning exactly as designed. At 1:07 a.m., the ACR system, which continuously monitors and transmits data about the aircraft's performance and condition, sent what would prove to be its final transmission. This routine message indicated that all systems were functioning normally. The transmission showed a normal routing all the way to Beijing, with no indication of any problems whatsoever. The flight was proceeding northward over the South China Sea, following a standard flight path that took it from Malaysian airspace toward the Vietnamese coast, where it would enter Vietnamese airspace before continuing on to China. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The passengers, many of whom had likely dozed off shortly after takeoff, had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. In the cockpit, the pilots were managing a routine flight on a route they had flown many times before. At 1:19 a.m., as the aircraft was approaching the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur instructed the pilots to contact Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control in Vietnam, standard procedure as the aircraft moved from one country's airspace to another. The response came from the cockpit, most likely from First Officer Farik, though this was not immediately certain. The final words transmitted from MH370 were simple and routine. "Good night, Malaysian 370. This sign-off was slightly informal. The standard phraseology would have been "good night," followed by the controller's call sign rather than the flight number, but it was not unusual or particularly noteworthy. The voice was calm and gave no indication of any problem. This would be the last communication ever received from Flight 370. What happened next remains one of the most debated sequences of events in aviation history. At approximately 1:21 a.m., just 2 minutes after that final voice communication, the ACRS system stopped transmitting. This system sends automatic updates every 30 minutes, and it was due to transmit again at 1:37 a.m., but that transmission never came. The ACARs can be manually disabled from the cockpit, but doing so requires deliberate action and specific knowledge of the aircraft's systems. Shortly after the ACARs went silent, at approximately 1:21 a.m., the aircraft's transponder stopped transmitting. The transponder is what allows air traffic controllers to identify specific aircraft on their radar screens, showing the plane's identity, altitude, and speed. When the transponder signal disappeared, the aircraft vanished from civilian air traffic control radar screens. From the perspective of civilian controllers, MH370 had simply ceased to exist. The aircraft never checked in with Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control as it should have. Controllers in Vietnam waited, then attempted to contact the aircraft. Receiving no response, they contacted their counterparts in Malaysia to ask if the plane was still in Malaysian airspace. Confusion reigned. Different controllers had different information. Critical minutes ticked by as controllers tried to understand what had happened. What civilian controllers did not immediately know was that MH370 had not actually vanished. Malaysian military radar, which does not require a functioning transponder and instead tracks aircraft using primary radar returns from the aircraft's metal skin, continued to track the plane. The military radar showed something extraordinary and deeply troubling. Instead of continuing on its northeastern course toward Vietnam and China, the aircraft had made a sharp turn. It had turned westward, back toward Malaysia. The radar track showed the aircraft crossing back over the Malay Peninsula, passing near Penang Island on Malaysia's west coast. At some point during this westward track, the aircraft changed altitude, though exactly when and to what altitude remains a matter of some debate. Different radar systems provided different information, and the radar coverage was not complete. What is clear is that the aircraft flew deliberately along a path that took it through a gap between Malaysian and Thai airspace, suggesting that whoever was controlling the aircraft had detailed knowledge of the region's air defense coverage. Vietnamese Deputy Minister of Transport Pham Quy Thieu would later state that Vietnam had noticed MH370 turning back toward the west, and that Vietnamese operators had twice informed Malaysian authorities of this observation on the same day, March 8th. Thai military radar also detected an aircraft that might have been Flight 370, though they could not provide exact timing of the radar contacts, and the signal did not include identifying information. The aircraft was not detected by Australia's conventional radar systems or its long-range Jorn over-the-horizon radar system, which has an official range of 3,000 kilometers, because Jorn was not in operation that night. The final confirmed radar contact with MH370 came at approximately 2:22 a.m. Malaysian time. Military radar tracked the aircraft as it flew northwest across the Malacca Strait and Andaman Sea toward the tip of Indonesia's Sumatra Island. Then the aircraft turned south, pointing toward the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. After that, it vanished from even military radar coverage. The aircraft had been in the air for approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes since takeoff, and it would continue flying for another 6 hours. But from this point forward, no radar system on Earth would track its position. The dawning realization. By 5:30 a.m., more than 4 hours after takeoff, when the aircraft should have been landing in Beijing, the Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center at the Kuala Lumpur Area Control Center was activated. The realization that something had gone terribly wrong was setting in, though the full scope of the disaster was not yet understood. At 7:24 a.m., nearly 6 hours after takeoff and almost 6 hours after the aircraft's last communication, Malaysia Airlines issued its first public statement. The announcement was brief and provided little detail. Contact with Flight 370 had been lost, and a search and rescue effort had been initiated. In Beijing, family members who had come to the airport to meet arriving passengers were growing increasingly concerned. The flight should have landed hours ago. Officials were not providing clear information. As news of the disappearance began to spread, relatives were gathered into a holding area away from the media. Confusion and fear gripped the waiting families. Many refused to believe that something catastrophic could have happened. Some held out hope that the aircraft had made an emergency landing somewhere. Others feared the worst. The scene at Beijing Capital International Airport would become one of the enduring images of the MH370 tragedy. Desperate family members seeking answers that no one could provide. The initial assumption by many was that the aircraft had suffered some kind of catastrophic failure and crashed somewhere in the South China Sea, in the area where it had last been in contact with air traffic control. This assumption seemed logical based on the last known position of the aircraft. A massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched in the South China Sea and Gulf of Thailand, involving ships and aircraft from Malaysia, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and other nations. For days, search teams scoured the waters, looking for any sign of wreckage, debris, or survivors. They found nothing. As the hours turned into days, reports began to emerge that complicated the picture. Malaysian officials had to acknowledge that they were not certain where the aircraft had actually gone. There were reports of military radar data that had not been immediately shared with civilian search coordinators. The Malaysian government faced intense criticism for the confused and often contradictory information being released. At one press conference, officials would state one thing. Hours later, that information would be revised or contradicted. The timeline of events was constantly being updated as more information came to light. On March 11th, 3 days after the disappearance, Malaysian authorities revealed for the first time that military radar had tracked an aircraft that might have been MH370 turning back and flying west across the Malay Peninsula. This revelation completely changed the search area. If the aircraft had indeed turned back, it would not have crashed in the South China Sea. The search was expanded to include the Malacca Strait and the Andaman Sea on the western side of Malaysia. Ships and aircraft that had been searching in the east rushed to search in the west. Precious days had been lost searching in the wrong location. The presence of the 2 Iranian passengers traveling on stolen passports had been discovered, leading to fears of terrorism. International intelligence agencies, including the FBI and Interpol, investigated these passengers extensively. Within days, however, they were cleared of any suspected terrorist connections, having been identified as asylum seekers with no links to extremist groups. Nevertheless, the speculation about terrorism persisted in some quarters, fueled by the lack of any clear alternative explanation. As the investigation continued, more details about the flight began to emerge that painted an increasingly puzzling picture. The ASAR system had been disabled. The transponder had been turned off. The aircraft had made a deliberate turn. These were not the actions of an aircraft suffering mechanical failure. They suggested deliberate human intervention. But who had taken these actions, and why? And where had the aircraft gone after leaving the range of military radar? The satellite breakthrough. The breakthrough in understanding where MH370 might have gone came from an unexpected source, a British satellite telecommunications company called Inmarsat. On March 15th, a week after the plane's disappearance, Inmarsat publicly acknowledged that they had recorded automated transmissions from the aircraft for several hours after it had disappeared from air traffic control radar. This revelation would prove to be the single most important clue in determining the aircraft's fate. Inmarsat operates a global satellite communications network for maritime and aviation applications. Their satellites, Inmarsat 3F1, positioned in geostationary orbit over the Indian Ocean, maintained an automated connection with MH370's Satellite Data Unit, or SDU, throughout the flight. Even though the aircraft's communication systems had been disabled, preventing any messages from being transmitted, the SDU continued to respond to automated hourly status requests from the satellite. These exchanges, known as handshakes or pings, occurred because the satellite would send a signal asking essentially, "Are you still there?" And the aircraft's SDU would automatically respond, "Yes, I'm here." Between 1:25 a.m. and 8:19 a.m. on March 8th, the Inmarsat ground station recorded 6 complete handshakes with MH370, plus a partial 7th handshake. These pings did not contain navigation data or position information. They were not designed to track the aircraft's location. However, they contained other data that could be analyzed to estimate where the aircraft was when each ping occurred. The data included the time it took for the signal to travel from the satellite to the aircraft and back, which could indicate the distance between the satellite and the aircraft. This is known as burst timing offset, or BTO. By analyzing the BTO data, Inmarsat's engineers were able to determine that at each handshake time, the aircraft must have been somewhere on a circle centered on the satellite's position. As the flight progressed, these circles moved, creating a series of concentric arcs. The 7th and final arc, corresponding to the last handshake at 8:19 a.m., became known simply as the seventh arc. Somewhere along this arc, more than 7 hours after takeoff, MH370 had made its final satellite connection. However, knowing the aircraft was somewhere on a series of arcs did not reveal which direction it had flown. The arcs extended both north and south from the satellite's position. The aircraft could have flown north over Asia, potentially reaching as far as Kazakhstan or western China, or it could have flown south over the Indian Ocean. Without additional information, there was no way to determine which path the aircraft had taken. This was where the second type of satellite data became crucial. The satellite data also included information about the frequency of the signals received from the aircraft. Due to the Doppler effect, the frequency of a signal changes depending on whether the source is moving toward or away from the observer. When an ambulance approaches you with its siren on, the pitch sounds higher. As it moves away, the pitch sounds lower. The same principle applies to radio signals. By analyzing the frequency shift of the signals received from MH370, known as burst frequency offset, or BFO, Inmarsat scientists could determine whether the aircraft was moving toward or away from the satellite. There was a complication, however. The satellite itself was not perfectly stationary. Inmarsat 3F1, launched 18 years before the incident, was reaching the end of its design life and was low on the fuel needed to maintain a perfect geostationary orbit. Instead of staying exactly over the equator, it was oscillating north and south by about 165 degrees every 24 hours. The aircraft's satellite communications equipment was programmed with a Doppler pre-compensation algorithm designed to account for the aircraft's motion relative to the satellite. However, this algorithm assumed the satellite was in a perfect geostationary position. Because the satellite was actually moving, and because the pre-compensation algorithm did not account for this movement, the frequency shifts recorded in the data were not fully compensated. This imperfection, which might normally be considered an error or flaw, actually provided investigators with additional information. By analyzing the uncompensated frequency shifts and comparing them with the known movement of the satellite, scientists could determine which direction the aircraft had been flying. Inmarsat's team, working with investigators from the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, performed this analysis using a technique that had never before been applied to an aviation investigation. They compared the BFO values recorded from MH370 with BFO values from other Boeing 707 flights that had flown known routes. They also modeled what the BFO values would look like for various possible flight paths. The conclusion was clear and heartbreaking. The BFO data was consistent with a southern path and completely inconsistent with a northern path. MH370 had flown south into the Indian Ocean. On March 24th, 16 days after the disappearance, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak held a press conference to announce the devastating conclusion. Based on the new satellite data analysis, it was determined that MH370 had flown along the southern corridor, and that its last position was in the middle of the southern Indian Ocean, far from any possible landing sites. With deep sadness, the Prime Minister declared that Flight 370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean. Shortly before this announcement, Malaysia Airlines sent text messages to family members informing them that the analysis of satellite data concluded there were no survivors. The announcement sparked anger and grief among the families of passengers, particularly in China, where the majority of passengers had originated. Many family members initially refused to believe the conclusion, arguing that without physical evidence, without finding the aircraft itself, there could be no certainty about what had happened. Some accused the Malaysian government and Malaysia Airlines of withholding information or covering up the truth. Protests erupted. Family members demanded to see the raw satellite data and the analysis that led to the conclusion. The tragic uncertainty would continue for months until the first physical evidence finally emerged. The underwater search. With the satellite analysis indicating that MH370 had gone down somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, the search effort underwent a massive shift. On March 17th, Australia assumed charge of the search operation, as the presumed crash area fell within Australia's search and rescue region. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, or ATSB, would lead what became the largest and most expensive search operation in aviation history. The task was daunting. The search area was in one of the most remote regions of the world, approximately 1,800 kilometers southwest of Perth, Western Australia. The ocean in this region is extremely deep, in some areas more than 6,000 meters, and the weather is frequently terrible, with strong winds, high seas, and storms that can halt operations for days at a time. The search was conducted in multiple phases. The first phase involved an aerial search of the ocean surface, looking for any floating debris that might indicate where the aircraft had gone down. At its peak, this phase involved military aircraft from Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia, as well as commercial aircraft. Ships from multiple nations also participated in the surface search. The search area covered more than 4.6 million square kilometers at its maximum extent. Despite the massive effort involving dozens of aircraft and ships, the surface search found no confirmed debris from MH370. After several months, in April 2014, the surface search was called off. If there had been any floating debris in the days and weeks after the crash, it had either sunk or dispersed over such a wide area that finding it by aerial search was impossible. The second phase focused on searching the ocean floor. Before this deep water search could begin, the seabed needed to be mapped. The region where MH370 was believed to have crashed was largely unmapped, with very little bathymetric data available. Mapping the ocean floor was a crucial prerequisite because underwater search vehicles need to operate close to the seabed to effectively scan for wreckage, but they also need to avoid colliding with underwater mountains and ridges. From June to December 2014, survey vessels mapped more than 200,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, collecting high-resolution bathymetric data that revealed an extraordinarily complex underwater topography. The actual underwater search began in October 2014. The governments of Malaysia, China, and Australia made a joint commitment to thoroughly search 120,000 square kilometers of sea floor. This phase of the search used 3 vessels equipped with towed deep-water vehicles that employed side-scan sonar, multi-beam echo sounders, and video cameras to locate and identify any potential aircraft debris. The search vessels, including the GeoPhoenix, Fugro Discovery, and Fugro Equator, methodically scanned the ocean floor in a grid pattern. The work was slow, difficult, and dangerous. The extreme depths meant that each pass of the towed sonar took a full day. Weather regularly forced suspensions of operations. Tropical cyclones, storms, and heavy seas plagued the search throughout its duration. A 4th vessel, equipped with an autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, participated in the search between January and May 2015, searching areas where the rugged underwater terrain made it difficult or impossible to use towed equipment. Despite the tremendous effort, sophisticated technology, and systematic approach, the underwater search found no trace of MH370. The seafloor yielded 19th-century shipwrecks, lost shipping containers, and geological features of interest to scientists, but no Boeing 777. The cost of this massive operation was extraordinary. By October 2017, the underwater search had cost a total of $155 million. The breakdown of costs was telling. Underwater search operations accounted for 86% of the total, bathymetric mapping 10%, and program management 4%. The financial burden was shared among the participating nations, with Malaysia supporting 58% of the total cost, Australia 32%, and China 10%. The United States, while not a primary funding contributor, spent $11.4 million on its participation, including the use of P-8 surveillance aircraft, underwater detection equipment, and naval vessels. Australia's contribution was particularly significant, with the country spending more than 550,000 Australian dollars per day just for one ship, the HMAS Success. On January 17, 2017, after more than 2.5 years of searching, the governments of Malaysia, Australia, and China jointly announced that the search would be suspended. The priority search area of 120,000 square kilometers had been completely searched without finding the aircraft. In a joint statement, the three governments acknowledged that despite the extraordinary efforts of hundreds of people, the main wreckage of MH370 had not been located. The statement emphasized that the decision to suspend the search was not made lightly, but that in the absence of new credible evidence, it was not possible to continue. The search for MH370 had become the most expensive in aviation history, yet it had failed to find the aircraft. However, by the time the official search was suspended, physical evidence had finally begun to emerge, thousands of kilometers from the search area. Starting in July 2015, pieces of wreckage confirmed to be from MH370 began washing up on shores around the western Indian Ocean. These discoveries would prove that the aircraft had indeed crashed into the ocean, but they would also raise new questions about exactly where the impact occurred. The debris trail. On July 29, 2015, more than 16 months after the disappearance, a worker named Johnny Bigu was part of a beach cleanup crew on the northeastern shore of Réunion Island, a French territory in the western Indian Ocean. At around 8:30 in the morning, Bigu spotted an unusual object at the edge of the surf. Roughly rectangular and about 6 feet long, it resembled a stubby aircraft wing and was heavily encrusted with barnacles and other marine life. Local gendarmes were quickly called to the scene, and within hours, the discovery was making international news. Could this be the first piece of MH370? The object was identified as a flaperon, a component of an aircraft wing's trailing edge. A flaperon combines the functions of a flap, which deploys to allow slower flight during landing, and an aileron, which controls roll. Aviation experts examining photographs of the object quickly noted that it appeared to be from a Boeing 777. The part had a stenciled marking inside, 657 BB, which aviation experts recognized as a code for a specific section of a Boeing 777 right-wing flaperon. Crucially, MH370 was the only Boeing 777 that was missing. The part was not from any other known crash or incident. The flaperon was transported from Réunion to Toulouse, France, where it was examined by the Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, France's Civil Aviation Accident Investigation Agency, along with experts from a French Defense Ministry laboratory. Malaysia sent its own investigators to both Réunion and Toulouse to participate in the examination. The critical question was whether this flaperon could be definitively linked to MH370. Every Boeing 707 flaperon has unique serial numbers on its internal components. Using a borescope, investigators were able to read serial numbers on parts deep inside the structure. On September 3, 2015, French officials announced that the serial numbers matched manufacturing records for the flaperon installed on 9M MRO, the aircraft that operated as MH370. The match was confirmed with a technician from Airbus Defence and Space in Spain, which had manufactured the part for Boeing. The French prosecutor's statement was unequivocal. It is therefore possible to confirm with certainty that the flaperon found on Reunion Island on July 29, 2015 corresponds to the one from flight MH370. After 16 months of uncertainty, here at last was proof that MH370 had crashed into the Indian Ocean. The discovery of the flaperon triggered an expanded search for debris. French authorities conducted searches of the waters around Réunion for additional wreckage. Various objects were found, including a damaged suitcase that was initially thought might be linked to MH370, though this connection was later deemed doubtful. Malaysia asked authorities in neighboring states and territories to be alert for any marine debris that could have come from an aircraft. Over the following months and years, additional pieces of debris would be discovered on beaches throughout the western Indian Ocean region. In December 2015, a piece bearing the marking "No Step" was found off the coast of Mozambique. Photographic analysis suggested it could have come from the horizontal stabilizer or the leading edges of the wings. In February 2016, more debris was found in Mozambique. In June 2016, a piece discovered in Tanzania was transported to Australia for analysis. In September 2016, this piece was confirmed as coming from MH370, specifically an outboard flap section. In May 2016, a left outboard flap trailing edge section found on the island of Mauritius was delivered to Australian investigators. In October 2016, it was confirmed through part identifiers as debris from MH370. By October 2017, 20 pieces of debris believed to be from 9M MRO had been recovered from beaches scattered across the western Indian Ocean. Of these 20 items, 18 were identified as very likely or almost certain to originate from MH370, while the other 2 were assessed as probably from the aircraft. 3 pieces were positively identified as definitely coming from MH370 through unique serial numbers or part identifiers: the flaperon from Réunion, the outboard wing flap from Tanzania, and the left outboard flap section from Mauritius. The debris discoveries were significant for several reasons. First, they definitively proved that the aircraft had crashed into the ocean, ending any lingering speculation that it might have landed somewhere intact. Second, they provided valuable information for drift analysis. Ocean currents and winds would have carried floating debris from the crash site westward across the Indian Ocean toward the African coast. By modeling the drift of debris backwards in time, scientists could estimate the probable origin point. Third, the debris offered clues about how the aircraft had broken apart, though the small number of pieces and their relatively minor damage made it difficult to draw definitive conclusions about the impact. Scientists at Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, or CSIRO, conducted extensive drift analysis using the recovered debris, particularly the flaperon. They obtained a genuine Boeing 707 flaperon and cut it down to match the size and shape of the recovered item. They conducted buoyancy tests and field tests in Tasmanian waters to measure how the flaperon would drift under different wind and current conditions. This testing revealed important information. The flaperon did not drift exactly in line with prevailing winds, but exhibited a drift angle of about 20 degrees to the left. Due to its high float attitude, the wind effect was greater than originally expected, resulting in faster overall drift speed. Using this data along with ocean current models and satellite imagery, CSIRO researchers concluded that the most likely crash location was at approximately 35.6 degrees south latitude and 92.8 degrees east longitude in the southeastern Indian Ocean. This location was northeast of the main 120,000 square kilometer search zone that had already been searched. The drift analysis suggested that the aircraft had come down in an area that, while close to the searched region, had not been thoroughly examined. This conclusion led to calls for a renewed search in the refined area. The investigation and theories. As physical evidence began to accumulate and the technical analysis of satellite data continued, investigators from multiple countries worked to understand not just where MH370 had gone, but why. How does a modern commercial airliner deviate from its planned course, fly for 7 hours, and crash into the ocean? What caused this tragedy? In the absence of the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, which remain lost with the main wreckage, investigators have been forced to rely on circumstantial evidence, technical analysis, and forensic examination of the limited debris that has been recovered. This has led to numerous theories, some supported by evidence, others based more on speculation. One of the most discussed theories centers on Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and the possibility of pilot suicide or deliberate action by the captain. This theory gained traction after investigators discovered that Zahari's home flight simulator contained deleted data showing a simulated flight that bore some resemblance to MH370's presumed final flight path. The FBI analyzed the hard drives from Zahari's home flight simulator and recovered deleted data points showing a flight path that began in Kuala Lumpur, flew around Indonesia, and ended in the southern Indian Ocean near an island with a small runway. This simulated flight had been created on February 2, 2014, 5 weeks before MH370's disappearance, and the data had been deleted on February 3rd. The similarities between this simulated flight and the actual path of MH370 are striking to many investigators and have led some to conclude that Zahari may have planned the diversion in advance. The ATSB's 2017 report confirmed these findings, providing new details about the simulator data. However, the significance of this evidence remains hotly debated. Zahari's family and supporters argue that he regularly experimented with various flight scenarios on his simulator, including extreme scenarios that a pilot would never encounter in normal operations. They note that having such a simulated route does not prove intention to carry it out. Critics counter that the specific nature of this particular route, created and then deleted shortly before the actual flight, appears too coincidental to dismiss. The interpretation of this evidence remains one of the most contentious aspects of the investigation. Supporting the deliberate diversion theory is the sequence of system shutdowns and the deliberate flight path. The ACRS system and transponder were disabled in sequence, requiring specific knowledge of aircraft systems. The aircraft then followed a path that took it between radar coverage zones, which could suggest familiarity with regional air traffic control and military radar coverage. The aircraft made deliberate turns at waypoints, indicating programmed navigation. These actions point towards someone with detailed knowledge of the Boeing 777 systems and regional geography, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain. In February 2020, former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who was in office when MH370 disappeared, revealed in a documentary that his understanding from the very top levels of the Malaysian government was that, from very, very early on, they thought it was murder-suicide by the pilot. However, Zahari's family has vehemently denied any possibility of suicide. Investigators who examined his financial records, medical history, and behavior in the days leading up to the flight found no evidence of financial stress, mental health issues, or unusual behavior that would indicate he was planning anything extreme. An alternative theory involving First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid has also been proposed, though it has received less attention. Some aviation experts have suggested scenarios in which Fariq, while alone in the cockpit, perhaps while the captain was using the lavatory, experienced some kind of emergency that led him to turn the aircraft around. One proposed scenario involves sudden cockpit depressurization, or smoke that might have incapacitated or confused the young pilot, leading him to make errors in attempting to return to the airport while in a state of hypoxia or distress. However, this theory struggles to explain the systematic shutdown of communications systems and the sustained flight for hours afterward. Another major theory involves fire on board the aircraft, particularly related to the cargo. MH370 was carrying 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries in its forward cargo hold. Lithium-ion batteries are known to pose a fire risk under certain conditions. They can undergo thermal runaway, a chain reaction in which overheating in one cell causes adjacent cells to overheat, creating an intense fire that is difficult or impossible to extinguish with conventional aircraft fire suppression systems. Several aviation incidents have involved lithium-ion battery fires, including a UPS cargo aircraft that crashed in Dubai in 2010 after a cargo fire. Proponents of the lithium battery fire theory suggest that such a fire could have generated smoke and toxic fumes, including carbon monoxide, that might have incapacitated the crew and passengers. Under this scenario, the pilots, realizing they had a fire, would have turned the aircraft around to attempt an emergency landing, but were overcome by smoke before they could land. The aircraft, according to this theory, then flew on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed. This hypothesis could potentially explain the turn back toward Malaysia, the loss of communications, and the extended flight time. However, experts in aircraft fire safety have raised significant objections to this theory. The Boeing 777's cargo compartments are equipped with sophisticated fire detection and suppression systems. Fire warnings would have been immediate and obvious to the pilots. The cargo compartment is designed to contain a fire for an extended period, well, beyond the time it would have taken to land at a nearby airport. The calm final communication from the cockpit showed no indication of stress or emergency. Most critically, in the approximately 2 minutes between the last communication and the disappearance of the transponder, there would not have been sufficient time for a cargo fire to develop, breach the fire-resistant cargo liner, and damage flight systems. Additionally, none of the recovered debris showed signs of fire damage when examined by experts. Hijacking theories have been proposed, but face significant obstacles. In traditional hijacking scenarios, hijackers make demands, claim responsibility, or have clear objectives. None of this occurred with MH370. No group has ever claimed responsibility. No demands were made. No communication was attempted. The 2 Iranian passengers traveling on stolen passports, who initially raised suspicions, were thoroughly investigated and cleared. They were determined to be asylum seekers with no terrorist connections. While some have theorized about hijacking for other purposes, such as stealing the aircraft or taking it to a remote location, no evidence has emerged to support such scenarios, and the discovery of debris in the Indian Ocean makes it extremely unlikely that the aircraft landed anywhere intact. The mechanical failure theory posits that some catastrophic technical problem caused the loss of communications and control systems, forcing the pilots to attempt a return to Malaysia while dealing with the emergency. Various specific failures have been proposed, including problems with the electrical system, the flight management system, or the windshield heating system. However, the Boeing 777 has multiple redundant systems designed to prevent total system failures. The aircraft's excellent safety record makes a mechanical failure of this magnitude extremely unlikely. More importantly, a catastrophic mechanical failure does not explain the systematic shutdown of communication systems before the turn, the deliberate flight path following navigational waypoints, or the extended flight duration. The Malaysian government's final report, released in July 2018, ran to 1,500 pages and confirmed that the aircraft was manually turned around, taking it off its normal flight path, either by the pilot or a third party. The report found no evidence of unusual cargo that could pose a danger, no evidence of interference by any third party, and no indication that any passenger or crew member had a motive to harm the aircraft. The investigators concluded that while foul play was probably involved in the disappearance, it was impossible to determine who had taken control of the aircraft or why. The answer, they stated, could only be conclusive if the wreckage is found. The human toll. Behind every statistic, every piece of debris, and every technical analysis lies a profound human tragedy. 239 people boarded Flight 370 that night, each with their own life, their own story, their own plans and dreams. For the families of these passengers and crew, the disappearance has meant more than a decade of uncertainty, grief, and searching for answers that may never come. In China, where 153 of the passengers originated, the tragedy struck particularly hard. Families gathered at the Lido Hotel in Beijing became a focal point for international media coverage. The anguished faces of parents, spouses, and children waiting for news became symbolic of the broader tragedy. Some family members refused to believe their loved ones were gone, clinging to hope that somehow the aircraft had landed somewhere and the passengers were alive. Others accused the Malaysian government and Malaysia Airlines of incompetence, cover-up, or worse. Protests erupted. Families demanded access to information, compensation, and above all, answers. The grief was particularly acute for families who lost multiple members. One Chinese woman lost her son, his wife, and her 2 young grandchildren, aged 3 and 4. In interviews, she expressed the unbearable pain of losing an entire family line. Philip Wood's girlfriend, Sarah Bajay, became one of the most visible family advocates, regularly appearing on international news networks to demand transparency and criticize what she viewed as inadequate investigation efforts. She spoke powerfully about the torture of not knowing, of being unable to grieve properly because there was no closure, no body, no certain knowledge of what had happened. Paul Week's wife, Danica, spoke about the moment her husband had given her his wedding ring and watch before the trip, a gesture that became heartbreakingly prophetic. She was left to raise their 2 young sons alone, knowing they would grow up without their father, but never knowing exactly what had happened to him. The Burrows family, who were about to become first-time grandparents, never had the chance to meet their grandchild. The Lawton family's vacation became a permanent farewell. For the Malaysian crew members' families, the tragedy was compounded by speculation about the pilots. Patrick Gomes, the chief flight attendant with 35 years of service to Malaysia Airlines, was a father and grandfather. His family mourned not just his loss, but also had to endure public speculation about whether someone in the cockpit had deliberately caused the disaster. First Officer Farrick's fiancée, Captain Nadira Ramli, lost her partner just as they were planning their life together. Captain Zahari's wife and children have had to defend his reputation and legacy while grieving his loss. The families formed support groups and advocacy organizations. The Chinese families, in particular, organized into a collective voice demanding action from the Chinese and Malaysian governments. They staged protests, sent delegations to Malaysia, and demanded that the search continue. Some filed lawsuits seeking compensation. The legal proceedings have been complicated by international jurisdiction issues, with different laws applying depending on where lawsuits are filed and what treaties apply. Malaysia Airlines faced bankruptcy in the aftermath of MH370, with bookings down 60% in China in March 2014 alone. The airline retired the MH370 flight number, replacing it with MH318. The tragedy was compounded just 4 months later when another Malaysia Airlines Boeing 707, flight MH17, was shot down over Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. The double tragedy within 4 months nearly destroyed the airline, which underwent significant restructuring and received government support to continue operations. For investigators, air traffic controllers, and search crews, the disappearance also took a profound psychological toll. Those involved in the search spent years looking for the aircraft, knowing that every passing day meant less chance of finding survivors, less chance of answers for families, and more resources expended. The dedicated teams who mapped and searched the ocean floor worked in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable, driven by the hope that they might bring closure to the families. In Malaysia, the tragedy raised difficult questions about air traffic control procedures, radar coverage, and emergency response protocols. The confusion in the initial hours after the disappearance, the failure to immediately recognize that military radar had tracked the aircraft turning back, and the sometimes contradictory public statements damaged Malaysia's reputation and led to calls for reforms in aviation safety procedures. Ongoing efforts and new technology. Although the official government-led search was suspended in January 2017, efforts to find MH370 have continued. In January 2018, the Malaysian government signed a contract with Ocean Infinity, a private American marine exploration company, to conduct a new search using advanced technology. Unlike the previous search, this would be conducted on a no-find, no-fee basis, meaning Ocean Infinity would only be paid if they successfully located the aircraft. Ocean Infinity deployed a fleet of 8 autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, from the Norwegian ship Seabed Constructor. These AUVs, unlike the towed equipment used in the first search, could operate independently without being physically connected to the surface ship. This allowed them to cover much larger areas more quickly and operate in challenging underwater terrain. The payment structure was on a sliding scale. $20 million if the wreckage was found within the first 5,000 square kilometers searched, rising to $70 million if found in more distant areas of the 20,000 square kilometer search zone. The Ocean Infinity search focused on a refined search area based on the latest drift analysis and satellite data interpretation. Between January and May 2018, the company searched more than 112,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. Despite the advanced technology and systematic approach, the search again found no trace of MH370. On May 29, 2018, the Malaysian government announced that the search would conclude, and Ocean Infinity confirmed that their contract had ended. Once again, the mystery remained unsolved. However, Ocean Infinity has not given up. In March 2024, marking the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, Ocean Infinity submitted a new proposal to the Malaysian government for another search. Malaysian Transport Minister Anthony Loke stated that the government was committed to finding the aircraft and would give due consideration to any credible proposals. The company claimed to have refined their search area based on additional analysis and improved technology. In December 2024, the Malaysian government announced that it had agreed, in principle, to allow Ocean Infinity to conduct another search. On February 25, 2025, Minister Loke confirmed that Ocean Infinity had resumed searching for MH370. The new search was to cover a 15,000 square kilometer area in the southern Indian Ocean and was expected to cost approximately $70 million, though again on a no-find, no-fee basis. However, on April 3, 2025, Loke announced that Ocean Infinity had suspended the search, citing that it was not the season for such operations in the region. The company indicated they would resume the search at the end of the year when weather conditions improved. New technologies and methodologies continue to be proposed for finding MH370. In 2024, researchers at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom conducted a study on underwater hydrophone signals generated by airplane crashes in the ocean. These researchers, led by Usama Qadri, claimed that hydrophone data could be key to detecting the final resting place of MH370. They noted that the signals they found in the currently presumed crash area and time frame were surprisingly weak and did not match the clear pressure signatures seen in other ocean crashes. This research suggested that either the crash occurred outside the presumed time and location, or that underwater acoustic analysis could help pinpoint the location more precisely. Another controversial methodology involves the analysis of weak signal propagation reporter, or WSPR, data. Some independent researchers have claimed that statistical analysis of this amateur radio data could track the path of aircraft through disturbances in the radio signals. Researcher Richard Godfrey has proposed specific crash locations based on WSPR analysis. However, other experts, including members of independent research groups, have disputed these claims, arguing that the signals scattered by aircraft would be far too weak to be detected in the WSPR data. This debate illustrates the desperation for new approaches and the challenge of finding credible new leads more than a decade after the disappearance. The families of passengers continue to advocate for renewed search efforts. VPR Nathan, whose wife Ann Daisy was on the flight, stated that while families want the search to continue, they also must be realistic about the costs. Jaquita Gomez, whose flight attendant husband was on the plane, expressed hope that the search would resume and continue until the aircraft is found. Jiang Hui, a Chinese national whose mother was on the plane, has called for better communication from Malaysian authorities and is part of a lawsuit filed in China demanding compensation. Aviation changes and legacy. The disappearance of MH370 exposed significant weaknesses in aviation tracking systems and led to major changes in international aviation safety protocols. One of the most shocking revelations was that in 2014, large commercial aircraft could still effectively disappear from tracking for extended periods. The realization that an aircraft could fly for hours over the ocean without its position being known led to immediate calls for improved tracking systems. The International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, responded by developing new tracking requirements. In 2018, ICAO implemented a new standard requiring airlines to track their aircraft at least every 15 minutes. This was later enhanced to require tracking at least every minute for aircraft flying over oceanic or remote areas. These requirements have been progressively implemented by airlines around the world. Many airlines have gone beyond the minimum requirements, implementing real-time tracking systems that continuously monitor aircraft position. The incident also highlighted issues with how stolen or lost passports were checked at airports. The fact that 2 passengers were able to board an international flight using stolen passports shocked security officials worldwide. Interpol maintains a database of 40 million stolen and lost travel documents, but in 2014, only a handful of countries were consistently checking passengers against this database. Following the MH370 incident, there was increased pressure on countries and airlines to implement more rigorous passport checking procedures. The handling of the MH370 crisis also led to improved protocols for international communication and coordination during aviation emergencies. The confusion in the initial hours and days after the disappearance, with different agencies and countries having different information that was not immediately shared, highlighted the need for better coordination mechanisms. ICAO and regional aviation authorities have worked to establish clearer protocols for information sharing during emergencies. The search for MH370 advanced underwater search technology significantly. The extensive mapping of the southern Indian Ocean seafloor created high-resolution bathymetric data that was donated to the Nippon Foundation GBQ Seabed 2030 project. This data has contributed to improved global ocean floor maps that benefit not just aviation safety, but also oceanography, geology, and environmental science. The autonomous underwater vehicles developed and refined during the search have applications for other deep ocean exploration tasks. For aviation safety investigators, MH370 has become a case study in how to handle investigations when physical evidence is extremely limited. The reliance on satellite data analysis, drift modeling, and circumstantial evidence has pushed investigators to develop new analytical techniques. The incident has also sparked debates about whether cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders should have their recording time extended beyond 2 hours, whether they should have independent power sources to ensure they continue operating even if aircraft power fails, and whether they should include automatic ejection systems that deploy the recorders in the event of a water impact. The emotional and psychological impact on the aviation industry should not be underestimated. Pilots, air traffic controllers, and airline personnel worldwide were deeply affected by the disappearance. It served as a stark reminder of the responsibility they carry and the potential consequences of system failures or human errors. The tragedy has been incorporated into training programs as a case study in crew resource management, emergency response, and the importance of following standard procedures. For the families of those on board MH370, the disappearance has meant a prolonged grieving process without closure. The anniversaries of the disappearance on March 8th each year bring renewed attention and renewed pain. Memorial services have been held annually, with families gathering to remember their loved ones and call for continued search efforts. Some families have established foundations or charitable organizations in memory of their loved ones. Others have become advocates for aviation safety improvements, working to ensure that no other families have to endure the uncertainty they have experienced. The enduring mystery. More than 11 years after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared into the night sky, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Where exactly did the aircraft crash? Why did it deviate from its planned course? Who was in control of the aircraft during its final hours? What caused the loss of communications? These questions may never be definitively answered unless the main wreckage is located and the flight recorders recovered. The satellite data analysis, while providing crucial information about the general area where the aircraft went down, cannot provide precise coordinates. The drift analysis of recovered debris can only narrow the search area, not pinpoint the exact location. Without the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, investigators cannot know with certainty what happened in the cockpit during the crucial period when the aircraft turned around and its communications systems went silent. Various theories continue to circulate, each with some supporting evidence, but none with definitive proof. The pilot suicide theory is supported by the flight, simulator data, the deliberate nature of the aircraft's movements, and the lack of any clear mechanical explanation. Yet it struggles to explain why an experienced captain would choose such an elaborate method, flying for 7 hours before crashing, rather than simply crashing the aircraft immediately. It also requires accepting that a pilot with no history of mental illness, no apparent motive, and a reputation for professionalism would commit an act of mass murder. The mechanical failure theories struggle with the implausibility of a failure that would disable communication systems in sequence, cause the aircraft to turn around following navigational waypoints, yet allow the aircraft to continue flying for hours. The fire theory must overcome the objections of fire safety experts who point out the sophisticated fire protection systems on the Boeing 777. The hijacking theory requires explaining who the hijackers were, how they gained access to the cockpit, and why they never made any demands or communications. Some have proposed that the truth might involve a combination of factors: perhaps an initial emergency or incident, followed by incapacitation of the crew, with the aircraft flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Others have suggested scenarios involving pilot incapacitation, while another person was in the cockpit, or a struggle for control of the aircraft. The lack of physical evidence means that all of these scenarios remain possibilities, though none can be confirmed or ruled out definitively. What is known with reasonable certainty is the sequence of events in broad terms. The aircraft took off normally from Kuala Lumpur. At some point around 1:21 a.m., the ACR's system stopped transmitting and the transponder was turned off. The aircraft turned back across Malaysia, flew northwest across the Malacca Strait and Andaman Sea, then turned south. It continued flying south over the Indian Ocean for approximately 6 hours, making its final satellite handshake at 8:19 a.m., before crashing into the ocean somewhere along the 7th arc. At some point during these 7+ hours, all 239 people on board died. The debris that has been recovered tells us something about the end of the flight. The relatively intact nature of some pieces, particularly the flaperon, has led some experts to suggest that the aircraft may have impacted the water in a somewhat controlled manner rather than a high-speed dive. Some analysts have examined the damage patterns on the trailing edge components and proposed they could be consistent with a ditching attempt, though others dispute this interpretation. The minimal damage to leading edges and the clean separation of some parts might indicate a more controlled water entry than a nosedive at high speed. But without the main wreckage, these interpretations remain speculative and contested among experts. The MH370 mystery has become a cultural phenomenon, spawning countless books, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos, and internet forums dedicated to analyzing every piece of available evidence. Amateur investigators have spent thousands of hours studying satellite data, ocean currents, radar reports, and debris photographs. Some of these amateur efforts have contributed valuable insights. Others have promoted implausible conspiracy theories. The disappearance has become a modern mystery that captures public imagination in a way few aviation incidents ever have. For the scientific and investigation community, MH370 represents both a failure and a challenge. It is a failure in that modern technology and extensive resources have not been able to locate the aircraft or definitively explain what happened. It is a challenge to develop better technologies, better analytical methods, and better international cooperation protocols so that such a disappearance can never happen again. The improvements in aircraft tracking and emergency response procedures that have been implemented since 2014 are part of the legacy of MH370, bought at the cost of 239 lives. The search for MH370 may resume in late 2025 when Ocean Infinity returns to the southern Indian Ocean. With each year that passes, the chances of finding the wreckage diminish. The underwater environment is harsh, and wreckage can become buried in sediment or further dispersed by underwater currents. Battery-powered emergency locator transmitters have long since exhausted their power. The acoustic pingers on the flight recorders went silent years ago. Any future search will rely purely on detecting the physical wreckage on the seafloor. Yet the families refuse to give up hope that answers may still be found. Every new technology, every refined search area, every new analysis brings renewed hope that this time the aircraft will be found. The Malaysian government has stated its commitment to continuing the search if credible new information emerges. The international community, having invested so much in the search already, remains willing to support efforts to solve the mystery. The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 stands as a profound reminder of how much we still do not know, how vulnerable we remain to the unexpected, and how even in our age of constant connection and surveillance, mysteries can still emerge. It has changed aviation forever, leading to improvements that may prevent future disappearances. But for the 239 people who boarded that flight on March 8, 2014, and for the families they left behind, these improvements came too late. The story of MH370 is not just about an aircraft that vanished. It is about human lives cut short, families forever changed, investigators and searchers who have dedicated years to finding answers, and a global community that watched in shock as modern aviation faced its greatest mystery. It is a story about the limits of technology, the complexity of international cooperation, the persistence of human hope, and the enduring need for closure in the face of tragedy. Until the wreckage is found, until the flight recorders are recovered, until investigators can examine the physical evidence and reconstruct exactly what happened in those final hours, the mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 will remain unsolved. The families will continue to wait for answers. The aviation community will continue to learn from what is known and work to prevent future tragedies. And the world will remember the 239 souls who vanished into the night sky, taking with them the truth of what happened during those fateful hours over the Indian Ocean. For more fascinating investigations into true aviation mysteries and the tireless efforts of those who seek answers, make sure to subscribe to Lore to Mystery. We explore the world's greatest unsolved mysteries with thorough research, compelling narratives, and respect for those affected by these events. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue to investigate the questions that keep us searching for truth.